Well, welcome to your big moment. We're in part 4 today. And what we're going to talk about today, I think, impacts all of us. Whether you're a Christian or whether you maybe wouldn't consider yourself to be a Christian, it still impacts you in, I think, a really powerful way. This is something that's probably impacting your relationships. Maybe you're dating or you're engaged or you're married. And I promise you, this is going to show up in your relationship. In fact, this probably shows up more when you're in a relationship with somebody than it ever would when you're single. But even if you're single, you're still struggling with this. You struggled with it in school. It's a thing that kind of made you want to cheat sometimes, even if you didn't. It made you want to promote yourself, even if you knew that was kind of weird. It's something you wrestle with at work. When you see it in other people, you really dislike it. But it's something that you struggle with yourself, and this is just a human issue, and it's something that the Bible addresses head on. And we're going to look at this issue. I'll tell you what it is in just a few moments, but we're going to look at it because it's really raised in the profile of one of the characters of the story of Esther. In the story of Esther, which is a biblical book that took place it's set in the Old Testament before Jesus came along, and we have been studying for the last 4 weeks the story of Esther. And Esther is one of those books that doesn't get a lot of attention in the church, but we wanted to draw it to your attention because it's a powerful story and it explains a number of things. So just to catch you up and a reminder for everybody who was here for the first few weeks, here are the main characters in the story of Esther. So we got a graphic for that. You can see that there's 5 principal characters. There's King Xerxes. He is the king of the superpower of the day, which is about 450 BC, the 5th century BC, several centuries before Jesus. And he's the king of Persia. He is the king of the most powerful nation on the planet. And you might recognize him from the movie 300. King Xerxes was one of the characters, one of the kings in that movie. And he's also figured prominently in the video game Assassin's Creed, as many of you know. Vashti was his queen, and she did something that got her in trouble. We'll talk about that in a moment. Then there's Mordecai and Esther, also known as Hadassah. They're both Jews. We looked at Mordecai last week, Esther 2 weeks ago, and they're Jewish people living in a foreign land. And then in the middle is Haman, and he's the guy we're going to focus on today. So what happened was King Xerxes called for Vashti. She refused to come and dance in front of his drunk buddies for good reason, and she got deposed as queen. That was the end of her. Esther then wins a competition that she really didn't enter willingly to become the next queen, and Xerxes makes her queen in place of Vashti. Last time we looked at Mordecai, we saw how our actions today can impact the generation tomorrow, and then Haman is the one that we're really going to focus on this week. And Haman is not Jewish, he's Persian. And he becomes basically, don't call him this, but he's basically the prime minister. He's the most powerful politician other than the king in the country. And there's several chapters in the book of Esther that focus on Haman. And he's got the character trait that I think all of us struggle with. So that's sort of where we are. That'll catch you up. And here's the problem with Haman. You know what Haman is? He's selfish. In fact, if you look up a definition of selfish, this is what selfish is, and we're just going to drill down on that today. But selfish, if you look at the Merriam-Webster dictionary, says this. It's an adjective that describes a person, an action, or a motive lacking consideration for others, concerned chiefly with one's own personal profit or pleasure. Now, probably when you're thinking about this, you've already got somebody in mind. And maybe you've got a brother or brother-in-law, you got a sister, you've got a child that you're going, oh my goodness, he's only 3, but boy, is he selfish. All kids when they're 3 are selfish, just so you know. Some of us grow out of it, some of us don't. And the question I want to wrestle with, because it's easy to pick on people and go, oh, I wish you would be less selfish. I wish my neighbor would be less selfish. I wish my husband would be less selfish. I wish my wife would be less selfish. That's easy to do it, but here's the question I want us to wrestle with today. How selfish am I? How selfish am I? And that's a very uncomfortable question. And what we're going to do is we're going to look through Haman's story and we're going to try to figure out how selfish we are in the midst of us. Because his story is so, it's almost, you can't make this stuff up. It's that funny. It's one of the most ironic stories in all of Scripture. It's one of the most powerful stories in all of Scripture. And just to catch us up where we are, what we've learned so far, in part 1 of the series, we looked at this thing in the whole book of Esther. We looked at that God is present even when God seems absent. And the reason that's important to notice is God never shows up, really, explicitly in the book of Esther. It's the only book of 66 books in the Bible that never mentions God. And so we ask the question, where is God? And when you're looking at this today, you can start, maybe if you've been tracking with us, to trace out where God is. And then next week, we're going to look at where God was in this story, even though he's never mentioned. And the reason that's relevant is sometimes God seems absent in your life. And some of you right now are going through a period where you're like, I am calling on God. He's not answering. Some of you are in a place where you're not Christians because you believe that God is absent in the world. So that's a really relevant theme. We saw that the reality is that God is actually still present even when it seems like he's absent. So that was part 1 that we saw in the series. The events of the story of Esther led us to that conclusion. Part 2, we've zeroed in on Esther. And what we realized is she makes some morally ambiguous decisions. She uses sex. When she's put in that position, and she hides her identity, she does all these things, and it's your character in the little moments that reflects your legacy in the big moments. There's no such thing as a big breakthrough, that all my problems are going to go away when I come into money. All my problems, I'm going to be a different person when I get a position. No, your character in the little moments reflects your legacy in the big moments. And the last week we looked at Mordecai, and this is what we learned from Mordecai. Your actions today impact a generation tomorrow. And we saw how his actions, we'll see that this is almost part 2 of that, how his actions in saving the king's life and calling Esther are something that we are still talking about. And all of you are leaving a legacy. You're leaving a legacy. Whether you're a Christian, whether you're not a Christian, you're leaving a legacy. And your actions today impact a generation tomorrow. So that's what we've learned so far. Today we're drilling in on selfishness. We're drilling down on selfishness. And Haman is the poster boy for narcissism. So without further ado, we're going to read a lot of Bible. Next week we're going to not read a whole lot. So don't complain next week when we don't read a lot of Bible, because we are going to compensate for that today. We're going to actually read the better part of 3 chapters of the book of Esther. Now, if you've already done your homework, this is old hat to you. But it's a powerful story, and it's just so interesting. It's my sort of responsibility to figure out how much Bible we're going to teach, and I couldn't keep cutting. It was just too great a story not to share. So we're going to share a lot of it. This may be the most Bible you've read in a long time, but that's okay. That's okay. It's great. And this is before we jump into it, this is what Haman reminds me of. And this is what's at stake, and this is why I wanted to spend a whole week drilling down on Haman and looking at the problem of selfishness. Because here's what's true, and this is why it's so important for you to root out selfishness in you, for me to root out selfishness in me. Because a life devoted to self ultimately leaves you alone. That as much as selfishness is really all about, well, see, if I don't stand up for me, who's going to stand up for me? If I don't say something, who's going to say something? If I don't do this, if I don't step up, if I don't assert my rights in this relationship, if I don't stand up for myself at work, if I don't get what I want, if I don't get what I deserve, if I don't get what I'm entitled to, if I don't get any of that, well, then I'm going to get left out. But this is what you know, and you see it in other people. How much do you want to hang out with selfish people? Not much. Do you really want to be around people who are devoted to themselves? No. And what you resist in other people, you're strangely, I think because of sin, drawn to in yourself. You're like, well, I don't like it when he's selfish. But you see, for me, it's a little bit different because if I don't, then I don't know. But here's what's at stake. A life devoted to self ultimately leaves you alone. And so we're going to look at that, and Haman shows us that. So here's the story. The Jews are now threatened to be exterminated. And the reason is that Haman, who we're looking at today, really hated Mordecai. Mordecai was a Jew, and for whatever reason, probably personal, as we saw last week, he was the one guy in the whole empire who would not stand up when Haman entered the room. Just showed a lack of respect. Was that a good decision, a bad decision on Mordecai's part? I don't know. He just did it. Made Haman crazy. Haman made a decision and got the king's favor and said, he didn't name Mordecai, but he just said, look, there's a guy and he represents a kind of people, and I think we should exterminate those people. It was the first attempted Holocaust. And King Xerxes says, fine, you can kill him and kill everybody like him. Kill all the, Xerxes didn't realize this at the time, but kill all the Jews. So all the Jews were threatened to be exterminated. And Haman was pretty happy about that because he got his way and he knew, you want revenge, Mordecai? Here it comes. Not only are you going to die, but everybody like you is going to die. And so he left the banquet pretty happy. That's the first verse of Esther chapter 5. Haman was a happy man as he left the banquet. But when he saw Mordecai sitting at the palace gate, not standing up or trembling nervously before him, Haman became furious. It's just one of those things. Maybe you've had that situation before. You don't think you're getting respect from your spouse. You don't think your kids are respecting you. You don't think that guy at work who sits next to you in the desk, that he respects you. And what does that do inside you? Come on, be honest. It rattles you. And you're tempted to say, well, I deserve more. I deserve some more respect. I need somebody. Well, that's what Haman was wrestling with here. And it made him furious. Now, this is the cool thing about the Christian life. Your emotions don't necessarily change. When I don't get what I think I might deserve, it still bothers me. But I think the difference that Christ makes in my life is I see it through a different lens. I realize that just because it bothers me, I don't have to act on it. Just because I feel slighted doesn't mean I need to treat other people in a disrespectful manner. But look at what selfish dude does. Look at what Haman does. So, however, in the moment, he restrained himself and went on home. Now, remember, he'd already won. It's like, Mordecai, you're going to die. And all your little people, they're going to die too. Because I don't like you, and I've got power, and I'm going to use my power. You've been around people like this at work? I'm going to use my power to execute a personal vendetta. That's what I'm going to do. Then Haman gathered together his friends and Zeresh, his wife, poor wife, and boasted to them about his great wealth and many children. You're around people like that? I mean, boars just talk about themselves all the time. I, me. This is what I've done. This is what I've accomplished. Look at what I've done. Look at how great I am. Look at the school I went to. Look at... Okay, so he's bragging about the honors the king had given him and how he had been promoted over all the other nobles and officials. You know, we all started out on the same field, but I kind of got ahead. I guess the king saw the genius that was within me, and so he promoted me. I mean, he's just that kind of a guy. And then Haman added, and that's not all. That's not all. Queen Esther invited only me. And the king himself to the banquet she prepared for us. Guess who got invited to 24 Sussex? Guess who got the private invite to the Oval Office? Guess who got invited to a private tea with the Queen, an audience with the Pope? Me. Hey, the CEO, he invited me for lunch. The president called me into the office, not really to reprimand me, but like, hey, we're close. Name dropping, ultimate name dropping here. She has invited me to dine with her and the king again tomorrow. And then he added, because he's got this moral angst, but this is all worth nothing as long as I see Mordecai the Jew just sitting there at the palace gate. But remember, we're going to get rid of him. But how are we going to get rid of him? So Haman's wife, Zeresh, and all his friends suggested, be careful who you hang around, because watch what happens to their advice. Set up a sharpened pole that stands 75 feet tall. Make a skyscraper, okay? And in the morning, ask the king to impale Mordecai on it. He's going to die, but let's make sure he really dies, okay? Let's do him in a really public way. When this is done, they say, these are his advisors, you can go on your merry way to the banquet with the king. Now this pleased Haman, and he ordered the pole set up. That night, new chapter, okay? That night, this is interesting. You want to start to see God at work? If you look between the lines, you can begin to see God at work. And we'll start to look at this next week. Again, not mentioned, not talked about. But that night, the king had trouble sleeping. So he ordered an attendant to bring the book of history of his reign so it could be read to him. I want to read about myself, he says. So in those records, he discovered on account of how Mordecai had exposed the plot of Bigthana and Teresh, two of the eunuchs who guarded the door to the king's private quarters. Now, if you've been with us in the series, you already know about this. This happened probably 5 years earlier, and there was this guy named Mordecai, and Mordecai actually exposed it. So they had plotted to assassinate King Xerxes. Many people had. He was an unpopular king at times. What reward or recognition did we ever give Mordecai for this? King can't remember. It's like, what was his name again? Oh yeah. Did we ever give him a car? Like, what did we do? Did we give him a raise? Did we buy him dinner out or something like that? Did we send him and his wife to Hawaii? Did we do something like that? Because I'm the king and I should probably do something like that. And his attendants replied, nothing has been done for him. And then the king, look at this, so ironic. Hey, who's that in the outer court? Who's that? Because you can't go and see the king unless you get invited in. So there's somebody in the outer court. As it happened, Haman had just arrived in the outer court of the palace to ask the king to impale Mordecai on the pole he had prepared. See the irony developing here? So the attendants replied to the king, Haman is out in the court. Bring him in, the king ordered. So Haman came in. This is just so fun. I mean, don't picture anybody you don't like in this story, but this is just so fun what happens next, okay? So Haman came in, and the king said, what should I do to honor a man who truly pleases me? Now, this is the problem with pride. Look at where Haman goes mentally. Haman thought to himself, whom would the king wish to honor more than me? I'm his number one guy. So he doesn't know what's really going on, and he's like, okay, I'm going to set up my own parade here. I'm going to get to set my own Christmas bonus. I get to determine my promotion here. So you want to know what you should do, king? I'll tell you what you should do. And then he rules. This is how selfish pride destroys people. This is what narcissism does to people. So he replied, if the king wishes to honor someone, he should bring out one of the king's own royal robes, as well as a horse that the king himself has ridden, one with a royal emblem on its head. Now, again, this is a different world, but like, what are we talking about here? Well, we're talking about, listen, I want his office. I want his office. In fact, you know what I'd like? I'd like Air Force One. That's what I want. I want to use Air Force One. I want to have my own day in the Oval Office. I want to be the most powerful man in the world. I want to have them play Hail to Haman when I show up. Okay, that's what I want. I want all that stuff. I want the clothes. I want the trappings of the office. Let the robes and the horse be handed over to one of his king's most noble officials, and let him see that the man whom the king wishes to honor and is dressed in the king's robes and led through the city square on the king's horse. Let him see that. In other words, I want a parade, and I'm going to be on the parade. Have the officials shout as they go, this is what the king does for someone he wishes to honor. Excellent, the king said to Haman. Quick, take the robes and my horse and do just as you have said. But that's not where the story ends. In fact, that's not even the whole verse, as some of you know, because you've read the story. Look at what that actually says. Quick, take the robes and my horse and do just as you have said, For Mordecai the Jew, who sits at the gates of the palace, leave nothing out that you have suggested. This isn't about you, Haman. This is about your enemy. This is about Mordecai. You do that for Mordecai. You know that guy you hate at the office? Do it for him. You know that neighbor you can't stand? It's like, oh, why isn't there ever a for sale sign on their house? You know, that guy? Do it for him. You know that relative you don't like at Christmas, the one that you have to spend summer vacation with? Do it for him. That's what you need to do. So, again, Haman's number 2, he's not number 1. Haman took the robes and put them on Mordecai. Placed him on the king's own horse, Air Force One, led him through the city square shouting, "This is what the king does for someone he wishes to honor." And afterward, Mordecai returned to the palace gate where he always sat, but Haman hurried home, dejected and completely humiliated. See, that's the power of humility. We're going to do a whole series on humility several months from now, but the thing about being humiliated is if you start with humility, you've got nowhere to fall. If you start with pride, you got a long way down. The prouder you are, the bigger the fall. But if you adopt a humble attitude toward life, when you get knocked off your horse, you haven't got much to fall. You're down there already. It's fine. That's one of the powerful things about humility. And isn't humility what you're attracted to in other people? But you resist it in yourself. Because there's something about self-preservation, even a little bit about self-promotion in all of us. And we just see that in Haman. So, he's humiliated, he's dejected, he goes home. When Haman told his wife Zeresh, remember he just had the previous conversation with them, and all his friends what had happened, because remember he was boasting the night before. His wise advisors and his wife said, well, since Mordecai, this man who has humiliated you, is of Jewish birth, you will never succeed in your plans against him. It will be fatal to continue to oppose him. Now, if you're Haman, you're going, where was this advice yesterday? All right. I asked you, told me put this big pole up, kill him, impale him 75 feet tall. It's the skyscraper of death. I was going to do that, and now all of you telling you, now, you look at that and go, well, no, that was a bad idea. Like, where were you yesterday? While they were still talking, the king's eunuchs arrived and quickly took Haman to the banquet Esther had prepared. So the king and Haman went to Queen Esther's banquet. Now, if you follow the whole story, Esther called a banquet. She hasn't revealed her identity. Xerxes hasn't probably put 2 and 2 together and figured out that she's Jewish and Mordecai's Jewish and the Jews are being killed. He hasn't done all that, but that is about to go down now. So the king and Haman went to Queen Esther's banquet. On this second occasion, while they were drinking wine, they did that a lot in that empire, the king again said to Esther, tell me what you want, Queen Esther. What's your request? I will give it to you even if it's half the kingdom. He's in love. Baby, whatever you want, you got it, okay? Whatever you want, you can have it. Half the kingdom you want, just take it. Queen Esther replied, if I have found favor with the king, notice the humility, and if it pleases the king to grant my request. Esther's being transformed in this moment. I ask that my life and the lives of my people will be spared. For my people and I have been sold to those who would kill, slaughter, and annihilate us. If we had merely been sold as slaves, I could remain quiet, for that would be too trivial a matter to warrant disturbing the king. I'm not going to bother you with my issues. Now the king responds. Who would do such a thing? Xerxes demanded. Who would be so presumptuous as to touch you? Esther replied, the wicked Haman is our adversary and our enemy. It's named. It's finally all the dots have connected. The moment of truth has arrived. Look at what Haman does. Haman grew pale with fright before the king and the queen. Then the king, who's prone to rages, we know this, jumped to his feet in a rage and went out into the palace garden. Oh my goodness, what am I going to do? Top guy up against my queen. I had no idea. I'm the leader. What am I going to do? He flies out into the garden. Haman, however, stayed behind to plead for his life with Queen Esther, for he knew that the king intended to kill him. Now, what you need to know is nobody was allowed to approach the king without permission unless he had the gold scepter raised. We know that. Secondly, and this is the way it was, these were monarchies. This isn't just this empire, it's every empire. You were not allowed to be with the queen alone. Remember the guardrail series we did? Like boundaries there, don't be with a woman alone. Well, nobody was allowed in those days to be with Xerxes' wife alone. Haman stays behind, and look at this. Pleading for his life with Queen Esther, who he wanted to kill. And in despair, he fell on the couch where Queen Esther was reclining, just as the king was returning from the palace garden. And the king exclaimed, "Will he even assault the queen right here in the palace before my very eyes?" It's like, dude, you're not Charlie, and she is not your angel, right? It's one of those moments where it's just, you can't touch her. She's my wife. Oh my goodness, what are you doing? And yeah, he was kind of innocent, but he was guilty. And I mean, his character was in question. And as soon as the king spoke, his attendants covered Haman's face, signaling his doom. The bag went over the head. Then Harbona, one of the king's eunuchs, said, "Haman has set up a sharpened pole." Oh, by the way, just information, king. Haman has set up a sharpened pole that stands 75 feet tall in his own courtyard. He intended to use it to impale Mordecai, but apparently it's available now. And the man who saved the king from assassination, do you remember him? So anyway, nobody's going to use that pole. Well, then the king says, well, then impale Haman on it, the king ordered. So they impaled Haman on the pole he had set up for Mordecai. And the king's anger subsided. So how do you feel about Haman? Any of you have any empathy for him at all? And any of you going, oh, come on, Haman, come on, Haman, come on, Haman. It's hard to love the guy, isn't it? I mean, it's tragic. You don't want to see anybody killed. You don't want to see anybody die. But I mean, are you really empathizing with him? No, who are you cheering for? You're cheering for Mordecai? You're kind of cheering for Esther. At this point, you're cheering for Xerxes, the most powerful man in the world. Why? Because of selfishness, because of narcissism, because of pride. That's why. And there's a sense in which all of us struggle with that. I struggle with being selfish. There are areas in your life where you struggle with being selfish. And when we see it in other people, we so resist it. We despise it. But there's something that won't let us go. Well, here's what we need to remember. A life devoted to self ultimately leaves you alone. If you're going to live your life climbing over the backs of other people, if you're going to live your life, everybody waiting on you, if work is going to be about getting ahead and not helping others, if your life is going to be about, no, I have come to be served, not to serve other people, guess how you're going to die? Alone. And you might have people around you, but their hearts won't be with you. Their hearts won't be for you. They'll be struggling. And remember, your actions today impact a generation tomorrow. A life devoted to self ultimately leaves you alone, which leaves this question. How selfish am I? How selfish am I? And if you were to ask yourself that question, how selfish do you think you really are? Now, the good news in all this is that the Christian journey, the journey that Jesus ushered in, the Christian journey, involves dying to self. If you're a Christian, a mark of your maturity will be the fact that you are dying to yourself. Christian maturity involves dying to self. You know those weird passages in the New Testament that say, I no longer live, but Christ lives in me? You know those passages that say, die to yourself? And you're like, oh, no. Because you're into self, empowerment and self-encouragement and self-esteem and all those. No. Die to yourself. And there was somebody who did. And you know his name, Jesus. And he died to himself. And because of it, you have life. And even people who are not Christians, even some of you, you're not sure whether Jesus is God, you're not sure, but his teachings, his life, his humility are so compelling that you can't dismiss him. You're like, I don't know whether he's the way to God, but there is something about that man. There is something about the way he lived. There is something to him that is so compelling, I can't take my eyes off him. And you know what that is? It's his humility. It's his humility. In fact, the people that you admire most are probably the most humble. They're never the most proud, I can tell you that. And Christian maturity, it's too bad because we live in an age where a lot of people who go around going, I'm a mature Christian, I'm a mature Christian, I'm a mature Christian. You know what that is? Pride. And it's prima facie proof they're not mature. Because a mature Christian dies to himself, dies to herself. And what lives inside is the Holy Spirit, the Spirit of Jesus Christ. God himself. Do you remember the birth of Jesus? It wasn't in a palace. It was in a stable. Do you remember the death of Jesus? It wasn't a big hospital vigil with all these people after ripe old age, waiting for him to die. It was the common death of a criminal that took him from the earth. It's humility. Humility. Jesus said, I haven't come to be served. I've come to serve. That's the gospel. That's why it resonates. That's why it resonates, even in a strange way, with people who don't believe. And yes, you got hang-ups, and yes, you got questions, and yes, you got issues. But that's what should define Christianity. It doesn't in large measure today, but it ought to. And even though it doesn't in others, doesn't mean it shouldn't define you. It should define you. And if you really want to grow, it's not about how much you know. In fact, knowledge puffs up, but love builds up. So how selfish am I? That's the question. How selfish are you? Well, interestingly enough, there's a test you can take. It's not a Christian test. In fact, I'll warn you, there's a little bit of language in it, but you can write a Christian test after and put that online. But there's a narcissism test. If you go to this, and in fact, on our app and our small group materials, you can just go to this link. You can click directly on the link, www.zero, that's not an O, it's zeroeb.com. And it's Dr. Drew Pinsky has designed a narcissism test. And he used it initially to test the narcissism, the self-absorption levels of famous celebrities. And not surprisingly, they're quite high. And you can go through about 40 questions, and it will give you a score in different areas. And you can have a look at the score, and that'll give you at least an objective measure. And it's not determinative. It's just, it's kind of fun, kind of recreational, but it could sound some alarm bells. Or it could let you know that maybe you've made some progress in your life. But there is a narcissism test. We want to encourage you to do it. Now, don't go around bragging about your results, okay? It's kind of like, I aced the humility test, man. I just aced it. Beat everybody. No, that's not the point. The point is it just gives you a place to start. And it's not perfect. It's not Christian. It's just mainstream. But I'll tell you, it gives you an idea of how you think about yourself. And humility is not really about thinking less of yourself, but it is about thinking about yourself less often and putting others first. So, that leaves the question, how do I become less selfish? How do you become less selfish? How do you do that? Again, we're going to do a whole series on this several months down the road. But to get us started, number one, and there are many ways, but these are just three. Listen, listen, listen. Proud people talk a lot. I talk a lot. I'm a preacher, all right? But you have to make sure it's not talking in and of itself. But people who talk but never listen, that's a bad thing. You don't like to be around people like that, blah, 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 all night long. In fact, maturity of conversation is even the willingness to listen and to care about other people and to engage them where they're at. So start listening. I tried to find it. I couldn't find it. But I swear, a couple years ago, I found an app that will measure how much you talk in a meeting. Did you know that? It records the different voices, then it gives you a score. If you're the guy, I couldn't find it. If you can find it, let me know. But I couldn't find it, but I thought that would be interesting. Can you imagine just going around with that all week and just see who talks most in your life? And if you're scoring 90% of the conversation, you probably need to listen more. And when you start to listen, here's another thing it does. Listening leads you to empathy. And the second thing you can do is you can begin to empathize with people. Empathize. Empathize is the ability to identify with somebody else's emotions. That's what Haman didn't do. He never thought about, well, what would it be like to be impaled on a 75-foot pole and have all your family exterminated? Well, he was going to find out, wasn't he, in the end? But empathy does that. And when you listen, you begin to empathize. Now, empathy sometimes can be in the wrong direction where you start to make morally dubious choices because, oh, well, who am I to judge and what am I to do? But if you're proud, empathy really helps. Really helps lower your narcissism, lower your selfishness. Third thing you can do is imagine what the right thing to do is and then just do it. I don't know, I find this more and more in my life. I just have to imagine, okay, what would a good person do in a situation like this? And then try to go out and do it, right? You ask yourself that, because my instincts aren't good. I'm a sinner, saved by grace. So you try to imagine what the right thing to do. What would a selfless person do? And then just go out and do it. And then just go out and do it. Ask that with your kids. Ask that with your spouse. Ask that at work. What would a responsible person do? What would a compassionate person do? What would a kind person do? What would a patient person do? What would a humble person do? And then just go out and do it. And over time, your habits begin to shape your character. So listen, empathize. And then figure out what the right thing to do is, and then just go do it. That'll help on your journey. Because ultimately, here's what's at stake. And none of you want this. None of you want this. A life devoted to self ultimately leaves you alone. Last week, someone came up after the message and reminded me of a story that I want to share with you as we close today. The story involves somebody that you probably know. His name was Alfred Nobel, and he founded the what? The Nobel? Exactly. That's what he's known for. That's his legacy. That's how we remember him a century and a bit after his death. Some of you might know this story. Some of you may not. That was not actually what his life was about. In fact, he was a munitions manufacturer. Do you know he was actually the inventor of dynamite? And he became by today's standards, billionaire based on his development of munitions. And he was from Sweden, and that's where he lived. And he was a global supplier of explosives that killed people. By all accounts, not a nice man, very selfish man, very driven. In fact, this will give you an insight into his character. His brother worked for him, and when they were experimenting with nitroglycerin and dynamite and things like that, an explosion killed 5 people. One of those 5 was his brother. But that didn't even change his mind. He just kept going. And as he got into his 50s, he became extremely wealthy, traveled all over the world, and he had several brothers. But once, when he was in France and his brother was in France, his brother died. Edvig died. Now, mistakenly, a French newspaper thought that Alfred had died, Alfred Nobel, and it published his obituary. So he was in the strange position of reading his own obituary. You know, it's Mark Twain. The reports of my death are greatly exaggerated. But there, he got to read it. He got to actually see what people said about him when he died. And it wasn't nice. I'll read to you what the newspaper in Cannes said. It said, the merchant of death is dead. Dr. Alfred Nobel, who became rich by finding ways to kill people faster than ever before, died yesterday. That's what he read. That had an impact. 7 years after he read that, he devoted 94% of his estate to establishing 5 prizes. It was, by today's standards, hundreds of millions of dollars of his remaining estate. And I'll establish 5 prizes, one of which was the Nobel Peace Prize. I'll just close by reiterating what we said last week. It's not too late. You know what happened a year or two after he did that? He actually did die. And his legacy today is very different. Now, I know this is hard, and that's why you need Christ at the center of your life. That's why I need Christ at the center of my life, because death to self is an excruciating process. But let this motivate you this week. A life devoted to self ultimately leaves you alone. And God never intended for you to live that way. Let's pray together. Father, I want to thank you for what we can learn from people like Haman. And as tragically ironic and at times even in our mind, funny but tragic as that story is, we see some of ourselves in him. We see the desire to be noticed. We see the desire to be listened to and to be maybe even a little bit more prominent than we are, to get ahead of others, to get the kind of advice that makes us feel good and sound good and look good. Even a little bit of that lives in all of us, because sin lives in all of us. But you came to deliver us from sin. And you came to show us another way. A way to live that reflects your character, because we're made in the image of God. And you lived humbly, Jesus. And you save us. And I pray for all of us struggling with selfishness. Maybe there's a few of us here who just know that we're at an all-time high when it comes to self-absorption. Help us to listen, to empathize, to figure out what the right thing to do is, and then just do it this week. And Jesus, I pray that as we put you more and more at the center of our lives, our maturity, our growth would be marked by humility, not pride, and death to self, in which, ironically, we find life. We thank you so much for this in Jesus' name. Amen.